Hi everyone, welcome to e-learning. So we're doing history grade 7 and the topic is still the Dutch settlement, and we're going to be discussing the slave legacy, free burghers and Trekboers. Now, in this topic, we're going to talk about the slave legacy and how Islam spread and Afrikaans developed, the free burghers, the Dutch and the French Huguenots, and how they expanded into the eastern parts of Africa, and the movement of the Trekboers and their lifestyles. So this is a picture of basically how you could see the Dutch arriving at Table Bay, and in the center at the top, how the Dutch treated their slaves by tying their hands in the back and making them live below deck. And on the top right is a picture of the settlement down at Table Bay. Now, at the bottom left, you could see the slaves carrying baskets on their head, and they were all tied. Uh, that prevented them from running away and escaping. And in the center at the bottom, you could see how their masters treated them. And lastly, at the bottom right, you could see the interaction of the slaves and the people together. Now, remember, it's very important to understand why we are studying history. You need to understand that you don't want to be people as you are growing and forming your character that oppresses other people. Now, you studying history to learn from past mistakes, not to form judgments against certain groups and communities and form resentments against them, but actually to learn from their mistakes and not repeat it. Okay, so we're going to continue. Now, the slave legacy at the Cape. Now, you need to understand what a legacy means. So, a legacy is basically something that is left behind. Now, the slave legacy can still be seen today, and how you see that is basically the culture of the people, the food that they ate, the way that they dress, their religion, and the language spoken at the Cape. Now, the slaves at the Cape in 180 years ago basically came from the east. They came from Madagascar and East Indies and Asia and North Africa as well. And in this time, the slaves were and their descendants made up an enormous cultural contribution at the Cape, and many of them were skilled builders, cabinet makers, plasterers, dressmakers, bricklayers, and carpenters. And this can be seen in the Cape Dutch buildings and the architecture that you find present day. Now, the slaves were brought to Cape Town, and they were different from all the other slaves in the world, because they had their own music, their own language, their own clothing and art, so they formed their own design. They were rich in color and they were different from the Cape Dutch style. Um, Now, the Cape Malay, they had their own music. And up till today, it is a Cape Malay tradition that is continued by the Cape Ministerial Carnival that is always held on the 2nd of January every year. And the style and the flavor of the Cape Malay dishes is very distinctive. So they ate delicious food like babooti, birdies, and samosas. And this was part of South Africa's culture and tradition. And I always thought samosas was always brought down from India, and it was an Indian tradition. So it just shows you how the Cape was a mixture of different types of people. And this is a picture of the Dutch architecture building, the Cape Ministerial Carnival on the top right, and the foods that they ate at the bottom. Right, so moving on, the spread of religion of Islam. Now, you must know that the slaves came from East and they brought Islam to the Cape as well. The European settlers were basically Christians, and the Khoikhoi and the Xhosa people followed their own African traditional religion. Now, in time, because of the work of the ministries, most of the indigenous people, which were the Xhosa and the Khoikhoi, they had become Christians as well. But when Islam arrived at the Cape, when people were brought in from different Islamic countries, including slaves that came from North Africa. You know, when we did Kingdom of Mali, the uh, Africans there had converted to Islam. So many of these slaves were brought in by the VOC and also from the East Indies, and these were all Muslim people. In 1693, Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar in the East Indies, he was sent to the Cape, and he was very involved in the war with the Dutch. Now, he was one of the great leaders that was instrumental in spreading Islam among slaves at the Cape. In 1840, there were 6,435 people who had converted to Islam at the Cape, and this was 1/3 of the population of the colony at that time. And in 18th century, the mosque and madrasas were established at the in Cape Town. And madrasas is basically a school that teaches Muslims how to read Arabic and to read namaz, and to practice the teachings of Islam. Now, for the slaves and their religion, Islam, this was a way of their life. It's the way that they lived. They practiced their religion, and it was part of their identity. Now, the symbol of Islam you could see here is in the center is the moon and the star. Why the moon is because each Islamic month begins with the birth of the new moon. Now, you can see the architecture of the mosque as well on the top right. It shows you how excellent they were in architecture. Now, today, Islam remains a vibrant and flourishing religion that is quite significant in social, cultural, and political influences in South Africa. Now, the largest group of South African Muslim community is in the Western Cape, and this can be seen by the number of mosques that is built in that region. Now, the development of Afrikaans. Now, Afrikaans basically, the slaves at that time had to speak with their masters in Dutch. Now, the slaves basically came from different places and they spoke different languages. So what had happened was that they combined the Dutch, Netherlands, French, German, Malay, and Frisian languages that both the slaves and the Trekboers spoke, and they made the language Afrikaans. So Afrikaans is basically a mixture of different languages together. Now, you could see in the picture here, this is the architecture of the slaves when they built another mosque. And did you know the first writing of Afrikaans language was actually in Arabic, written by the Muslims from the Cape. Now, we're going to discuss the Dutch and the free burghers. Now, the Dutch East India Company offered work at the Cape to both the Dutch and the French citizens. And the reason for this was because they wanted to expand basically the amount of food that was being produced at the Cape at that time did not sustain all the ships that were coming in. So they had to expand. So what had happened was that the French and the Dutch that were there at the Cape were brought in on a 3-year contract. And when this contract had expired, they were free from the Dutch East India Companies, and they were now called the free burghers. And they could own land and they could also own slaves. And this played an important role in developing the Cape society. Now, the settlement of the Cape was unable to grow foods to feed the people at the Cape settlements. And to solve this problem, Van Riebeeck allowed VOC employers to become free burghers and farm. So they were free citizens. Now, there were 9 free burghers, and they were given farms along the Leesburg River in 1657. And they had to sell their farm produce to the VOC. and they owned the land. So part of the produce that they made was sold to the VOC, and part of the produce they kept for themselves and they sold to other people. Now, at that point, the Cape had changed from a refreshment settlement to a colony. And the Khoi saw that the Dutch farmers began to settle in the land, and they became very worried about losing their grazing land. Now, the French Huguenots in 1685, the Dutch East India Company wanted to develop more farming land. So they decided to bring in the French Huguenots. Now, they brought three people in, and these Huguenots were French Protestants that were persecuted in France by the Catholic. So that means that they were treated cruelly and unfairly. So the Dutch were also Protestants, and they offered these Huguenots a new home where they would be safe. And between 1688 and 1689, 175 Huguenots settled at the Cape. And in 1729, there was 279 Huguenots that descended to the Cape. And the picture at the bottom shows the first ships that brought the Huguenots to Table Bay. Now, the effect of the Dutch settlement on the Khoi. So now, obviously, with this expansion, the Khoi was very worried about they losing their land. So the number of free burghers had increased, and the Khoi had lost a lot of herd and grazing land as a result, and they did not want to give up their land without resistance. So what they did was that they poisoned water holes and they fought two wars with the Dutch. And the Khoi lost because the Dutch had guns and horses, while the Khoi only had swords and spears. And the Khoi was forced to give up their grazing land to the Dutch. And without grazing land, they lost their livestock to the free burghers alongside um, uh, so they worked alongside with the free burghers and the slaves, but they weren't so happy to work for the Dutch, so they basically moved away, and they moved and joined the San by the 18th century. Now, the movement of the Trekboers in 1700s, the VOC got wheat and wine that they needed from the Freeburgers farm in and around the Cape. The VOC needed livestock farmers to supply meat, and the stock farmers were encouraged to move inland. That means moving north and east from Western Cape. And these livestock farmers were allowed to establish huge farms. The farmers moved around to find better grazing for their sheep and cattle, and they basically left their farms for months at a time, and they became Trekboers. So a Trekboer means that they moved from place to place, and they became hunters and they traded with the Khoi. Now their lifestyle of the Trekboers, they enjoyed living in small isolated groups, and they made rare trips to Cape Town because they felt uncomfortable dealing with the Dutch East India Company because the Dutch wanted to control them. They saw the Dutch East India Company as being oppressors because they taxed them heavily and they interfered with their hunting and their trading with local tribes. The Trekboers were also keen on hunting and enjoyed the freedom of moving around, and they were called the Trekkies, meaning that the spirit of moving. And they moved tough adventures. They were poorly educated, but they were very religious. They called themselves Afrikanders, and later they became known as Afrikaners. Now, the Trekboers spoke a language that was called Dital, and this was the early version of Afrikaans, and it was based on the Dutch and also French, German, Malay, and Frisian languages. Now, their lifestyle was basically that they traveled with their slaves and their servants on ox wagons. They had horses and guns. They lived in tents and wagons. They hunted animals and meat. They got milk and meat from sheep. They visited their towns from time to time to get supplies. And they boiled fat from their fat trailed sheep with wood and ash to make soap. and this is a picture of how they lived. Now, I can't continue because I'll have to include it in my next slide because of time constraints. So the next lesson is going to be land disposition. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a lovely day. Bye, everyone.